Shabbat Shalom, everyone. After 31 years here, you should know that I don't do this pause for me. I do it for you because I don't want you to feel distracted or interrupted by people walking around you and speaking. So, good to be together. It's always good to be together on Shabbat. And although I feel Marisol and her family's joy and the joy of Shabbat, there is a lot that is weighing heavily on me, and I know weighing heavily on all of you. At least there should be if you see what's happening in our world. I want to begin with a story. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a Hasidic legend. But I'm going to try to tell it straight because it's related to an experience which I had 31 years ago. And what I learned from it and continue to learn from it, and how I see some of its messages repeating themselves over and over again. I'm doing it now because the story comes to me every Purim since 1994. And now, in the name of honesty, I will tell you that my Purim at that year was changed forever and will always be a different experience than it was before 1994. A part of this story is familiar to all of you. At the time, I was in my final year as a rabbi in a community in northeastern Ohio, in Youngstown, Ohio. And on that Purim, news came across the world from Hebron, or Kiryat Arba. Dr. Baruch Goldstein, a settler, a religious extremist, a Kahanist, yet a man who was respected in his own community, he went to the cave of Machpelah on Purim with an automatic weapon. In the section that was known as the Ibrahimi Mosque, the section where Muslims prayed, he opened fire and he gunned down 29 innocent men, women, and children, and he wounded more than 100 more. It was Purim and it was Ramadan. And this act was a blight against the Zionist project, as we say. It was a black mark on the Oslo Accords. It really helped destroy the chances of peace. And frankly, it was a blight against our people, the Jewish people. The Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian communities throughout the world were shocked and in mourning, as was much of the civilized world. How could it possibly be? And we asked ourselves, how could a Jew commit such a savage act of terror? We said to ourselves, Jews don't do that. That's what we told ourselves. But a Jew did that. And sadly, we asked that question too frequently. At that time, I was the co-chair of a Palestinian Jewish dialogue group, representing my community, representing the Jewish people. And together we worked really hard at creating civil responses towards each other in the community. As both communities were advocating with local congressmen as well as presenting programs in the community. And what we did is we landed on respect for each other. Often the dialogue was tense, but it was usually quite meaningful. After the massacre, the Palestinian leaders of the Youngstown community were given a task of hosting a memorial service at their community center, the Arab Community Center on Belmont Avenue in Youngstown. It was a central place between Detroit and western Pennsylvania, where those of you who know the demography of the Arab community, the Muslim community in the United States know that thousands of Palestinians live in that region. The night that they decided to host the meeting, that is the night that the decision was made to host the meeting, I was called by the chairman of the Palestinian community, who was my partner in dialogue. His name was Sam Bahur. He asked if I would meet him for a cup of coffee at the local McDonald's. He told me he had an important question for me. So we met the next morning, and I expressed condolences for the tragedy that his people had experienced. He proposed to me that I come to the memorial service. I was unsure what to say. Frankly, I felt a bit anxious about my safety, and yet I believed that my presence would be for good. Why would I go? Because I realized that I had an opportunity as a representative of the Jewish people to say that we are horrified and we are sorry. I was just one Jew, one rabbi, who could express this to a large group of people who were experiencing their own suffering at that time. You see, essential to my sense of our religious faith is that I believe we need to be able to see and to feel the pain of neighbors, and that empathy actually can foster meaningful connections. Today, the world is truly missing that. So I told Sam that I needed a day to get back to him, and when I got home, I called the executive director of our local federation, and he said, "Rabbi, don't go." I called the president of my synagogue, who was ambivalent about it, and said, "I think it would be a good idea, but call the police and let them know about the invitation and see if they would recommend that you attend." And so then I called the chief of the local police department, and he said, "Rabbi, it's a good idea. It'll be good for the local community." And he explained to me that there would be sufficient security, much of it undercover. The next night, I arrived at the Arab Community Center, which was housed in a warehouse behind a shopping plaza. It was a rainy night in northeastern Ohio. It was late March that year, and as I drove into the parking lot, which had become a field of mud, I remembered at that moment that I had a bumper sticker on the back of my car that said, "Shalom im HaGolan." I didn't think that would be a problem until it was time to leave. And my car was literally stuck in the mud, and young men had to push me out, but it was not an issue. Well, I walked into the community center, and I heard the low dint of a large crowd. It was a very large crowd. I walked past room dividers that had pictures of children in paramilitary clothing doing training exercises, a frightening vision from their summer camp. It only increased my anxiety. There was no air conditioning in this large warehouse, very little airflow, and it was dimly lit where hundreds of people were sitting under a haze in the room. I was walked to the front of the room and sit in the first row while an imam was giving a fiery sermon in Arabic with lots of yells from the crowd and people applauding, and I sat down. My heart was racing. I did not look behind me. More speakers came up, and candles were lit for those who had died. And then I came up to speak. So what did I speak about? Well, I extended my condolences, and I spoke about the meaning of that Machpelah, that place where in both of our traditions, the father of our people is buried. Ibrahim, or for us, Avraham. And I spoke about understanding the pain and tears, the agony, when one loses a child to violence. And I said, I believe that Father Avraham and Father Ibrahim are weeping also. And we, I said, are all the children of a common ancestor. And I'm sure that they and mothers and fathers should never, ever lose children to violence. Never, ever. This act was an act of an extremist, and it has brought only suffering, has done nothing for the cause of either people. And then I shared with them that we too have suffered greatly from the acts of terrorists and extremists. We know this pain. And that we all, Israeli and Palestinian, Muslim, Christian, and Jew, have an obligation to walk a different path that might create a different future If not for our generation, then perhaps for our children's generation and for future generations. So I offered my condolences and said a prayer of peace for everyone there. There was something very ironic that followed. For the next day, the front page of the local newspaper, which ironically is entitled The Youngstown Vindicator, there was a headline and a photo of me speaking. And the headline was, "Local Rabbi Speaks at Palestinian Memorial." I actually was very ambivalent when I saw that. Sure, everyone likes to be quoted and have their picture in the newspaper for the right reasons. But I believe that the local Palestinian community needed to receive the condolences of the newspaper and the attention of the community. Well, this week, once again, we observed and we celebrated Purim. But I'll always remember that Purim in 1994 and the message. The Purim story is our story, and it's a beloved story. We read and repeat and celebrate annually as we have for 2,300 years. Incredible. And throughout most of those years, our people were very vulnerable and very weak and had no autonomy and often faced extinction. But luck, or perhaps the hand of God and human ingenuity, brought us to a different future, a place where we began to realize more of our strength. Ultimately, we read in the Megillah, "LaYehudim hayata orah v'simcha v'sason." The Jews found light and happiness and joy. And it was not the Jews, but it was Haman and his followers that met their demise. Purim is our holiday of making fun and masquerades and feasting and drinking. For so long, we had no power, we had no land, we had no way to defend ourselves, and so we created this celebration where victims became victors. And it was not merely the reversal of the fortunes of Mordecai and Esther and the Jews of Shushan, as Haman was hung, but the Megillah story becomes a vehicle to create something larger. The Megillah story is a revenge story. And we don't speak about that very much. We don't like that which makes us uncomfortable. Generally, we like simple, black and white stories, good versus evil. We don't like complexity very much. And we never want to shine a light on something that may not make us look so good. Do you remember Quentin Tarantino's film Inglourious Bastards from about 15 years ago? It was a fictional account of Jewish GIs who lived out this revenge fantasy and killed hundreds of Nazis. I'll admit it, that felt good. It felt as if good ultimately won over evil and justice prevailed. But that film was also fictional. That's not what happened. We know that. 6 million Jews, 9 million people died at the hands of the Nazis. Well, that type of fantasy also happens in the Megillah in a very strange way. Chapter 9 of the Megillah describes the revenge the Jews take on those in the rest of Persia. And reading it should make us uneasy, uncomfortable, unless it is that our own trauma led to the loss of any moral sensibility within us. Because in that chapter 9, the Jews kill 75,000 Persians, way more than Haman and his sons. So let's be clear. In our understanding, the book of Esther is not a historical text. The story it chronicles, according to Bible professor Mark Brettler, never happened. He says it's more like comedy or farce. But even if we relate to the Megillah of Esther as pure story, as a rich and finely crafted parallel about masks and inversions and the challenges of living in an era where God's face is hidden and God's name is absent as it is from the entire Megillah, how could or how should we deal with that kind of violence that's found at the end of the story? We never talk about it. We never bring our attention to it. And for years, it simply sat as a disturbing revenge story, but now it seems it is more because it approaches a certain reality. My grandson, Manny, who's 5 years old, called me on Thursday afternoon, and he asked me to tell him the story of Purim. I told him the story in a very short fashion. I didn't go much further than the story of Haman getting his due and his sons getting his due and we giving each other gifts and giving to the poor. I didn't mention to him chapter 9, where there was a revenge on 75,000 people. But it raises a much deeper question, not only about the ethics of warfare, but for us in a religious setting, it raises the question of what are the stories that we tell, and do we want that our legacy will include that type of violence and ugliness? Or are we willing to confront it and to find some meaning in it? And rather than going back and relying on the past, seeing how we evolve as a people, as human beings, as Jews. You see, I think that the human being is such that we don't want to do that because we don't want to hear about our potential responsibility in bad stuff that goes on. It's the opposite. What we want to do is to deny it. In fact, often denying it to the point where we don't even want to speak about it. We do this with our own families too. I know that. I know that just about everyone who sits here carries some dirty little secret. If not about their own lives, about the lives of parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles. And generally we think, or should say, we feel that we're much better off not bringing that stuff up, not sharing it with other people, although it makes up a part of our lives. In the Parsha this week, there's a big unanswered question. The people commit this great sin, this apostasy, the building of the golden calf, and next to no time after being redeemed from slavery with miracles and God's awesome, awesome power, they lose their faith and they build this idol. It becomes an object of their worship. And one of the questions to be asked is, where was Aaron? Where was Aaron, who was the leader of the people? What did he do? And you know what he did. He did nothing. And that's a real blight on his reputation. But we don't want to speak about that. It makes a very important figure in our history seem irrelevant. There's so much in life that we don't want to speak about. It's true with us personally. It's like we're afraid to speak about difficult things. It's true with us as a people also. Some stuff just makes us too uncomfortable. But this is what I have learned in my life. If you don't speak about the stuff that makes you uncomfortable, it doesn't go away. It doesn't get fixed. It stays there. It festers, and it gets worse. So back to my evening at the memorial service, I had to go there and to speak when I was asked. And my community, the members of my congregation needed to talk to me about it. Because as bad as things were, they knew that when we don't talk about these things, it doesn't get better. We know that. We pack things in and inside of ourselves. Eventually, we can burst from that. Depression, heart attacks, all sorts of things can happen to us. Well, I'm not going to say what you should do about the horrible situations that we find in this country at this time, or stuff that can happen with the diseases that may begin to appear in large numbers, or the numbers of people, good people, who have lost their jobs, or what's going on with the climate, which is just beyond anything we could have dreamt, and the economy. But I will say that these are all things that need to be spoken about, and everybody must be heard as we speak about it. Nobody should be silenced. Too many people are suffering in this country and in this world, and it appears that there will be more people suffering. It's as if there's been some kind of a transition that's taken place from our concern about individual lives to our need for some kind of national greatness. And we think we can ignore the plight of individuals. Last week, a friend of my daughter's, who's an independent filmmaker and was involved in the creation of the Academy Award-winning foreign documentary, Not in My Life, she sent me a copy of the film. If you watch the Oscars, you may remember the Palestinian and Israeli filmmakers who spoke with such deep passion about having to find another way after they received the award. Immediately, the Academy and the film were condemned by so many. They said it was one-sided, which it probably was. It didn't give a context. But what it did was presented the pain and suffering of individuals, men, women, and children. It showed expulsions and demolitions of homes and schools, and the destructions of wells that gave people water. IMDb, the independent film database, indicated that the context, the history, and the background of the events was missing. But what we know is it doesn't detract from a human story, and the human story is a tragic story. We can't forget about the life of individuals. We know that the image of God it's not found in a nation, it's found in people. What I felt was the most horrific sight in the period of time from October 7th, 2023 until just recently was the sight of what happened to the hostages who were returned to Israel by Hamas. It was in this perverse, deranged moment of the return of the Bibas kids. These people celebrated the event with their children, with music and food, and it was so sick and so inhumane. These were people incapable of seeing the pain of others, incapable of seeing the godly image that existed in these innocent little children. Nope, they delighted in the pain of Jewish children. You know what? I'm not making a political statement here. I'm mentioning all of this in the context of a story I told. Purim 94 in the 9th chapter of the Megillah, and our responses to these things. Our responses to what happens to people in our world. What happens to all of those workers who have been working hard and honestly and with integrity in this country? You see, I know we don't want to witness the unpleasant. We don't want unpleasant thoughts or memories to be kept alive. But we have them. We have them from our own experiences. 35 times in the Torah, we're going to be told to remember that we were slaves, that we were strangers. Our lives are really vast, complex tapestries, and I think our challenge is to confront the flaws and continually try to make the future better than the past, not just for ourselves, not just for our nation, but for all people in this world. Passover is going to do this, and thankfully we're moving towards that. It's not simply a celebration of the sweetness of freedom. It also recognizes the bitterness of oppression and slavery. And although you know that I believe we must always protect ourselves, and as you've heard over and over again, it is the first law of Jewish ethics, we also know that the flaws in humanity begin with us. And we have to be the one or the ones that will always remain open to human pain, to people in need, to people who are suffering. And these things have to be spoken about. So let me conclude with the following. It's what I wish for. I'd love to see leaders in this world speak a little bit less about success and greatness and a little bit more about values. Not just to speak about strategies and markets and power. We need leadership that's willing to confront the pain that people are experiencing as a result of policies, and where relief can and should be brought. As I said, human nature is such that we don't want to be exposed to the scenes that make us cringe or make us feel badly about ourselves, not just about others. But you know what? We have the intelligence and the strength, and we need the will to face that which is real and at least try to make things better for ourselves and for others. That's what we can do. We can try. Shabbat Shalom.